Well, hello everyone, welcome to the latest edition of EdTalks. The topic everyone is discussing at the moment is the private rented sector and what is happening with landlords. And anybody who reads the papers, you get the usual selection of people who come and talk, whether they're from Shelter, Gen Rent, whoever it is. When you hear people talking about landlords, you almost always hear them talking about this gentleman sitting next to them, who I've spoken often to, but never actually met. And he looks incredibly young. So who is Ben Beadle?
Who is Ben Beadle? Well, Ben Beadle is first and foremost a landlord. He's been a landlord despite these youthful looks for 20 years, Ed. And I've got the grey hairs to show for it. I've always worked in housing. I started my career as a very, very young man in property management. I then spent a good many years at TDS, the deposit scheme, working on disputes, then working with letting agents, then setting up a landlord scheme in partnership with one of my legacy companies, the RLA. Set up schemes in Northern Ireland, Scotland, the custodial scheme in England. Then wanted to do something a bit different, went to Places for People, the Touchstone part of the business, which looks after some of the biggest landlords in the UK. So these shops out here, flats over, typically we would manage all of those and develop them, asset manage them, get tenants, all of that sort of jazz. And we had about 20-odd thousand homes across the UK for a whole range of different clients, including build to rent. And then I thought I'd throw my hat in to the ring for this job when it came up, and blow me, I got it. So
that job is?
Chief Executive of the National Residential Landlords Association.
Okay, and that is representing, well, not representing, but it's a membership organisation.
Yeah.
How many members?
We have about 102,000 members. Our members have typically in the region of about 700,000 homes across the private rented sector, but we also know they dabble in other areas as well.
That's quite a lot. So you said 102,000 members with about 700,000. How many homes do we think there are in the sector?
Well, it's a good question. We were talking about this before it came on. Well, I mean, what we know about the sector is that it was doing this and it's going up. And I don't think a lot of people would necessarily realise that from the figures that are out there. We know that the sector looks after over 4 million households, and it's got an important role.
Okay, well that's what I want to check. So in other words, 400,000 households, 700,000...
4 million,
pardon me. 700,000 that your members represent, you think that's a pretty big chunk. That's getting on for 15, 16, 17%. So.
It's, I mean, in terms of number of homes against number of households, I mean, we represent a decent amount. But if you think about the number of landlords that are out there, actually we represent quite a small amount. That's the honest truth. So we reckon that there are somewhere in the region of about 2 million owners. That's people that kind of declare an interest on their tax return in land. Not all of them would be relevant to our sector, but either way, there's plenty more fish out there for us to catch and support.
Sure, but you just said that the sector was going down and now it's coming up.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean in terms of the overall size of the sector. We know the sector, so this is based on the English Housing Survey. So before Christmas, around my select committee appearance, maybe it was around September, numbers of homes had fallen by about 200,000.
Number of homes in the sector?
Number of homes in the private rented sector. Post-Christmas, that has gone up. And you're going to ask me why that's gone up. And I don't fully know why it's gone up. I could put it down, if I was being Machiavellian about it, to council tax disaggregation. That basically bans each room as an individual dwelling, and we know that a lot of local authorities are doing that, but that's certainly not the sole reason. There are still people investing in the sector, and there are still people that are building from scratch, just not to the level that we need, right?
But the figures can be a bit misleading then. So in other words, you're saying that this disaggregation is individual rooms are popping up as residences. Yeah, so it's okay. But I think anybody who's in the industry, certainly from my side, and I know a lot of estate agents, as do you, would tell you that people are getting out of the sector.
And that's a different issue. The same, but this is about sentiment, right? So we know that across our membership, it's fair to say that they're very pessimistic about the outlook. If you look at any sets of figures that come out, it's talking about what landlords are going to be doing with their stock, with their investments, and we're predicting the biggest disinvestment in the sector for a decade. Others like Savills and Hamptons are also predicting a reduction in the number of landlords, and we're seeing it firsthand, that the sentiment is, I'm going to do something with maybe one of my properties, maybe not my entire portfolio, but there's obviously a time lag between somebody getting peed off with the direction of travel and actually doing it. My argument is, let's not wait for that to happen. Let's listen to all of the signs. Let's look at clearly demand massively outstripping supply, and let's have some pro-growth measures that really encourage property development and investment to give people the homes they need, because social homes aren't really being built. They continue to be flogged off. The build-to-rent market are suffering a very similar sort of crisis of,
and it's quite small, the build-to-rent
sector as
well, under 200,000 homes, so it's small.
So if everything in the pipeline was built, it would only equate to about 4.5% of the overall housing stock in the UK. The PRS is at just under 20%. So I guess the PRS has had a massive downer on it because of some of the rogue elements that has gone.
Well, it's been, I tell you, Ben, it's very frustrating. I mean, I've clearly been around even longer than you have doing this, and I was one of the agents that the Bank of England used to come to post the 08-09 crisis. And they were absolutely paranoid, the Bank of England, that all landlords must have been Daily Mail readers, and that they all owned 4 or 5 properties, all with 90% loan to value, and as soon as interest rates went up, they were all going to head for the exit.
Yeah.
And they were absolutely terrified of landlords being out of control. And my reading of that was very, very clearly at the time that they simply didn't understand who owned property.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of landlords, not the vast majority, but a significant number of landlords own properties because they want to live in them later, they're for their kids, there are all sorts of other reasons. They're not doing it for income. No. Indeed, my advice at Douglas and Gordon to landlords was always, don't look at it for income. This is a long-term capital play, which is the way most sensible people look at it. And we all know that since then, Section 24 has come in, the taxes that you can write off against your income, the wear and tear allowances have disappeared. You look at the last couple of years, you've had interest rates going up, you've had energy costs going up. So we all know those reasons why landlords would think about heading for the exit. Is there anything that we've missed?
I don't think so. And, I was at a meeting with Rachel McLean.
Who is?
She's the PRS housing minister.
Okay. Because you've just come back literally from a meeting with Michael Gove this morning. So we'll talk about that in a minute.
Indeed.
So Rachel McClellan.
And Felicity Buchan, her predecessor, was directly asked, well, what are the incentives for landlords to come into the PRS or to stay in the PRS? There was no answer. And I think this is problematic because I think for me, Ed, this is about making homes available for people that need them, good quality homes. We're not talking about the crappy end of the market. The vast majority of landlords do a great job, right? But this is about making sure that the homes are available. And with every carrot, there's a stick. I get that, but the trouble is we don't really have very many carrots now, and I think the feeling is that this is not a sexy place to be. And I'm afraid deriving a sustainable profit off the back of housing is not a dirty word. It applies to the private rented sector, it applies to the social sector as well. The reality is, everybody needs to have something in it for them in order to provide those homes. And the moment that it isn't, well, people will, go and buy some premium bonds or do something else.
Yeah, I mean, it's long been a game. Well, it's not a game. 20% of housing, and maybe it's a little bit more than that, is private rented sector. That's a big chunk. That's a big chunk, and I don't think people have any idea that it's so big. So when you mess around with that, you really mess around with one of the major suppliers of housing to people in the UK. So I'd love to have a magic wand and wave it about and say, what would we do ideally? I mean, do you think rolling back Section 24 would make a significant difference?
I do. I absolutely do. I mean, we should bear in mind that 60% of properties of landlords have mortgages, so 40% don't. And this is the thing with some of the measures in the sector, you know, they don't always affect everybody. And so you do need a little bit of everything. What I would say on Section 24 is its policy intention was to cool the market and make it less attractive. Well, you've done that, good job. And in fact, earlier this morning on the way to Gove, I bumped into George Osborne coming out of the gym that I go to, and I was going to clobber him on Section 24 because of course it was him that brought it in. My view is that this is a legitimate business expense, right? Actually, by making those changes, you're not only making it less attractive, but you perversely incentivize the holiday let market in a way that I don't think that you ever wanted to do. To me, it would seem far more beneficial to make it attractive to have your property rented out for a longer period of time to a family, that sort of thing, where there's greater safety standards, etc., than, you know, making it available to a hen party.
Well, of course, I think they've now realised that was a balls up.
Indeed.
And they're now seeking to legislate, or not legislate, but to
make
make that part of the planning
Indeed.
process.
But that itself, you know, is not really we don't need lists and regulation for everything. I think it was Jacob Rees-Mogg that was saying on GB News a few days ago that, you know, this sort of heavy-handed approach of limiting and discouraging people from doing what they want with their property is you know, really incredibly anti-conservative, to be honest with you. Of course, they need to do it in the right sort of way and, you know, make sure they're looking after people and that sort of stuff. But, you know, I don't see the need. Actually, the best solution would be to roll back Section 24 and leave the holiday let market. It would, you know, it would kind of solve. So let's just talk briefly about your meeting this morning. I know there's a certain amount you probably can't say about your meeting this morning. Was there anything that you came away from that with where you thought actually there was a chance that might happen, that they might roll it back? Well, no. No, there wasn't. He did mention it, actually. He did mention it. It's Chatham House rules, so I have to be a little bit careful about some of the things that I've said. But my views and our views are well documented on this subject, right? And, you know, you go into bat with as many of those things that you want to get across as possible. What wasn't subject to Chatham House rules was my meeting with him 4 weeks hence, where that was raised, energy was raised, a whole number of things were raised. Now, he did say in the House that, you know, he recognised that property tax needed to be looked at. It's not within his levers as the Secretary of State to, you know, to do that sort of stuff, although obviously he's a big hitter. He did though make a nod towards some of the energy changes and saying that he was sort of not changes because they're proposals, let's get that right, but saying he understood the concern of landlords around energy efficiency and the you know, amount that they would potentially have to pay. So those two things were quite interesting comments in themselves. Certainly there is an awareness of some of the changes that have been made that are adversely affecting the sector. That message has landed, and it's landed very loudly. What they do off the back of it, who knows? And part of the discussion today was actually around his vision for the sector and what the private rented sector should look like. But we've seen that vision. It's set out in the Fairer Renting white paper, and there will be some nips and tucks to it. You know, we win some, we lose some. But that paper doesn't deal with the fundamental problem in our sector, which is this supply and demand imbalance.
But the fundamental problem, as you say, this imbalance between the fact that the direction of travel seems to be for landlords to think this is getting more and more difficult. Why would I want to get into it? Yep. If one's going to try and reverse that and get people to look after properties, and my experience is like yours, vast number of landlords that I've ever dealt with look after their properties, good relationship with tenants.
Yep.
The problem as far as I can see it, is that people like Gove are surrounded by people like Generation Rent, Shelter, who come at this from a different political, I don't want to second guess your politics, but they tend to come at it perhaps from a different side of the political spectrum. And they talk about rent controls, and they look at the tenant as being downtrodden, and for the vast majority of people in the rental sector, they're not downtrodden or treated particularly badly. But it's always that minority that you hear about, and it is normally a very, very small minority of people you hear about that get the bad headlines. How likely is it that you're going to be able to engage sensibly with people like Shelter and Generation Rent?
Well, we have a good go. I mean, what I would say to you, Ed, is that actually I have quite good relationships with Polly at Shelter. Alicia, she's just left, and there's a new guy on his way in. But look, we come at, you're right, we come at this from slightly different viewpoints. Those guys, and I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying it, were lobbing a hand grenade and kind of see what's left at the end of it. And that's where sort of rent control comes from. Actually, the best thing, and I've discussed this with Shelter and Gen Rent, the best, you don't want to choke off supply even further with something like rent control, right? So actually, why couldn't they support our calls on fairer property taxation? Why couldn't they support some of the calls for, yes, more social housing, but backing the properly, this.
But how likely is that? I know that's what you'd like, but how likely is that to happen?
Well, I mean, we've not seen it thus far, have we? We can join calls on social housing to be built. I don't see any appetite for greater social housing to be built. And so I guess we try and operate in a more pragmatic, solution-led way, whereas others will say, so today, classic example, Shelter said that abolishing Section 21 will be a great route to ending homelessness. And I had to say, well, that's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish. And I said that to Mr. Gove. I said, look, I wouldn't want you to leave this meeting with the impression that Section 21 is going to magic everything away. It's not. It will certainly give a bit more security. I accept that, and security for tenants is a good thing. But I'm always at pains to point out that the average tenancy length is 4.5 years. That's not an insecure sector, but there are pockets of examples of landlords that have maybe used Section 21 in a way that perhaps the responsible landlord wouldn't use.
Yeah, but again, it's a very small number. They can still resort to Section 8. There are other things that they can do to get to get their properties back. It is extraordinary. When I was a young estate agent, we used to sell quite a lot of the older short tenancies, the old tenancies that were just long-term ones where people had acquired rights and the owner couldn't kick them out, and they were sold at 60-70% of vacant possession value, etc., etc. I can't believe that politicians are sort of, what's the right word, sleepwalking back into a similar sort of situation where I can't believe that's the case. One of my big bugbears about housing is that it is, like it or not, it's a political topic. Now, it's a political topic that none of them seem to actually do anything about.
No,
they all sit at elections and say, yeah, this is top of the list, and then we've had whatever it is, 19 housing ministers in 20 years or whatever it is. It's madness, and that encompasses Labour as well as coalition and Tories. So it's Labour don't have a monopoly on supposedly looking after the tenants.
No,
they really don't. But how does one take housing out of politics?
With great difficulty, because housing is linked to so many things, isn't it? Health and mental health and families and social mobility, all of that sort of stuff. There is an argument that you should pick up the housing function and just have it, kind of independent from any kind of politics. I just don't see that that's possible, to be honest with you. And so for as long as that continues, it will play out as a political football. Who's gonna build more houses? And that irritates the hell out of me, because government doesn't build houses anymore. They just create the environment for people to build it.
No,
right? So,
was Gove honest about why he's dropped the 300,000 target?
do you know what? So we didn't get onto the target, but we did speak about the need for the supply challenges to be kind of resolved, but not in any kind of meaningful
But the only way you do that, surely, is to have people taken out of politics who know who needs what where. And, there's no one-size-fits-all policy for the UK. You give one target, that doesn't make any difference. You've got to know who needs what sort of housing in what specific location, and then you've got to build infrastructure to support it, etc., etc. It's really not an easy thing to do. But I just can't help feeling that if you do pick it up and take it out and put it somewhere else outside politics, so you stop Labour thinking, we got to look after tenants, and Tory thinking we've got to keep house prices up and keep landlords happy, etc., etc. This ridiculous partisan system, which is just mullering the property market, or certainly the private rented sector, not the property market. The property market is a market and will do what it wants, but there's so much legislation that's impairing the way the PRS works. It just seems madness to have any politics entering into that, which it is at the moment. And again, that's why I slightly decry the lobby groups, I don't blame Gen Rent Shelter, these guys for advocating for tenants. And equally, I don't want it to be a them and us. You've just said you go back a long way in the sector. Yeah. You've really seen it on the front lines. I worked for years at an agency where we had thousands of tenancies, so I know that the face of landlords is not the way it's often portrayed. Nicholas van Hoogstraten was 50, 60 years ago. There aren't people like that around there. Those sort of people just don't exist. There may be one or two small examples of it, but the vast majority of people, of landlords, want to have good relationships with their tenants. They want to look after their properties. And the government seems hell-bent on kicking them out of the industry. That's the way it appears to me. And saying this is what first-time buyers should be buying. That was the original argument. You wanted to shift first-time buyers in and get landlords out. And that just doesn't seem to be working, does it?
Well, it's just not realistic in the environment that we're in. How are you going to turn generation rent into generation buy with mortgage rates at the levels that they're at, with rents at the levels that they're at?
But those are, the mortgage levels you talk about, again, you are old enough to remember that those are relatively normal rates.
True. But I think we've got used to, certainly, and this is where some of the landlord issues come from. We've got used to sort of cheap money, and obviously
But that's not honest, though, is it? Cheap money is. I suspect that after the inflation-linked interest rate rises that we've got at the moment, when inflation falls away, I think there's. The world economy is still not in a great state, so interest rates will come down again. So I suspect the landlords you're talking about will get their way again, and that there will be cheap money again. But that's still not the norm.
No, maybe not.
So you talk about that as being one of the issues that's creating problems. Now, yeah.
So as people come off their fixed terms, so we know that a third of borrowers are coming off a fixed term over the course of the next year. And so they would be fixed at a low percentage going to a much higher percentage unless, they remortgage in some way. But either way, it's going up.
You're talking about landlords.
I'm talking about landlords here. And I think when you combine that with tax pressures, less kind of incentives, other cost of living related matters in terms of being able to service the accommodation as a package, that's becoming problematic. And I think that we are, we are seeing higher rents as a result. So actually landlords for forever, frankly, have only ever raised rents. Typically when when a new tenancy is being created, they tend not to do it during the tenancy. What we're seeing now is more landlords having to take steps to raise their rents during the tenancy. And I don't accept the argument that it's somehow greed. I just don't. I'm sure you'll be able to find a few dozen cases of where it is greed, but this is, it's the market that sets the rents. it's the external factors that landlords are having to say, right, well, I'm running this as a business. This has gone up. This has gone up. Look, guys, I'm going to need to adjust.
It's like
the
everything
rent.
else, yeah.
We're not immune from.
But it might explain why there is so much of a polarised argument from tenants. And now, what else have we missed that we're not talking about? What else does Ben want to talk about in terms of the sector?
Well, I guess some of these other changes that we've got coming down the track in terms of rental reform. That was actually the main crux of the discussion that we've been having with ministers, including Gove today. I mean, Section 21 is only one part of those reforms. We've got things like an ombudsman. We've got things like the property portal, i.e. a register of some description. We've got abolishing fixed terms and starting on periodic tenancies. We've got how the courts are going to service all of those things in the new world. And then, of course, we've got implementation. And that was one of the things that I did raise, because there'll be many of your listeners that have property in Wales. And Renting Homes Wales has been A, a long time in the coming, and B, an absolute bloody car crash in terms of implementation. It's helpful for me, because I said to Gove, make sure you look at Wales and just don't do what they're doing.
So what have they done that's wrong?
Well, effectively, A, they promised a proper lead-in time, and they're still...
A lead-in time
for people to get used to the rules and effectively have a...
So this is licensing...
Yeah, this is a moving away from no fault, having longer notice periods, moving to a standard contract, a whole range of changes. Some of the biggest changes, frankly, for a generation. But what they have done is rather than have, get everything sorted and then have a lead-in time, actually they've been sort of introducing things effectively during the lead-in time. And it's caused a massive crisis of confidence. Now, obviously Wales is a much smaller country than, say, England, but it does reinforce the same point that whilst there might be an urgency, if you will, to abolish Section 21, we must be careful to make sure that the alternative to Section 21 is robust and works for responsible landlords, and that there is a proper lead-in time for everybody to know the rules of the game and how it's going to work with education and all of that sort of stuff. Because, as I said, if we get these things wrong, the crisis of confidence that the sector is seeing at the moment is not going to get any better. And you can point to abolition of Section 21 giving people greater security of tenure, right, making it a bit more difficult for landlords to get possession of their property. But if they do wish to sell, or they do wish to move back in, or they've got egregious rent arrears, they will be able to get possession within a short period of time. That's not going to solve homelessness. That's going to exacerbate homelessness in some way, because under Section 21, you didn't intentionally make yourself homeless. If you don't pay your rent or you commit antisocial behaviour, well, then you will. And I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how some of these things play out. So there's a huge package of things that are coming down the track, but lob into that the energy side of things. That's a huge concern for landlords and agents who probably do want to comply, but are seriously looking at their investment.
When you say comply, you mean comply with the new EPC regulations are you talking about?
So proposed EPC regulations are moving the benchmark to a C.
E to C, I mean, it's a big change.
It's a big change within. The timeframes are pretty academic now because it's gone on for such a long time.
Just before you go on, because when you say energy, a lot of people listening to this will think, hang on, he's talking about gas prices and energy prices rather than EPCs. For those who don't understand it, the government is keen to make sure that the quality of properties that tenants live in is that they have the best ratings for sort of heat retention, etc. To give us some idea of what the difference if you've got a standard Victorian house, and I think I'm right in saying that most standard Victorian housing is going to struggle to get to a C full stop.
Yeah.
But what is the difference between an E and a C?
Well, it's a very good question, because the underlying algorithm is a bit like the Colonel's secret recipe. You throw a few things in, but you're never quite sure what you're going to get out. So, and this is something that has landed with the department, actually, that the actual measure in the EPC is not really fit for purpose. It doesn't tell renters to any degree that how what their bills are going to look like, what all of that sort of stuff, and it doesn't really. You have a lot of assumptions on the EPC, and so my advice to landlords, if you're looking at your EPCs, well, make sure that it's based on actuals rather than assumptions. I think we've reached the view that the EPCs is, whilst a well-intentioned measure for both landlords and tenants in terms of how you can improve the energy efficiency of your property and what you are moving into and how it will, keep you warm and all of that sort of stuff, is old hat. It needs refreshing, and so it's not quite as easy to say, well, if you're at E. You need
put
to
in a heat pump or whatever
exactly.
it is.
I mean, you get some guidance on the document about what you could do within the individual dwelling to improve it, but that, as you rightly say, will vary on a whole range of factors. The Victorian house that you describe, well, we know that we have a very ageing stock in the private rented sector, a third sort of pre-1919. You may not have a cavity wall. You may not be able to fit a heat pump. You may not be able to get double glazing if you're in a conservation area or whatever. So what's the choice? Don't do it. Spend 10 grand or not have that home available to somebody. And so the delay that we have seen, and bear in mind these are just proposals at the moment, there was a lot of chatter a few weeks or so ago that it was going to be 2028 and push back. We haven't got confirmation of where government are going with this, and I don't really think that we've got a great deal of confirmation about, because I don't want to tell my members, well, rip out this, rip out that, and put in a heat pump when government hadn't really set its stall out. And I think with all of this, Ed, the policy ambition is sound. Government want to improve housing stock. That's fine. Who wants to let their tenant move into a drafty, not energy efficient property? But of course, all of that has to be underpinned by what you can actually do, and that there isn't a one size fits all. So you need to make sure that with every stick there is a carrot, and property owners must be helped financially to be able to.
Yeah, it does make sense. I mean, if they're going to improve their energy efficiency, their EPC rating, then it makes sense for them to have some sort of incentive to do so, be that tax or whatever it is. Okay, I mean, I'm well aware that for most people they listen to what I tend to talk about in the subjects on a commute or whatever. So we don't want to go on for too much longer. But if you were to look at where do you think the PRS will be in, say, 24 months' time? Will Section 21 have gone? The EPC, as you say, the target is for 2028, so that's quite some way away still. Do you think there might be? I'd be interested to see what Ben Beadle thinks, where you think the PRS will be in 24 months. So not next year, the year after, 24 months.
Labour government, certainly abolition of Section 21, possibly entirely discretionary grounds for repossession, and I worry that if it is a Labour government, we will have some element of localised rent control. Cheery place to end, right?
Well, cheery place to end. But listen, I'm really grateful to you. I think there's so much that a membership organisation like yours can bring, because I know it's very easy to say that the only landlords who would join a membership organisation like yours are the more enlightened ones. But what's wrong with that? I mean, the whole objective is to have people who have been enlightened, and I know we've talked a bit. Very kindly, you recommend Vuba to your members, and we're very grateful for that. They're a significant part of our business. But from an estate agency point of view, I can see that for most businesses, it is funny how it works. When I started an agency, sales was what it was all about, and people used to buy good sales businesses. Now they're not interested in the sales parts of businesses; they're really, really interested in the letting side of business. And of course, I think the value of these businesses is only going to go up again, because if interest rates come down, the capital values is going to go up of these businesses. And possibly they've come off over the last sort of year or so because interest rates have gone up. So it's a fascinating time. And I really wish you the best in your battles is the wrong word, but you're talking to government, which must be like fighting your way out of a paper bag sometimes. And also you're having to engage with some of these these lobbying organisations, which we've talked about in the programme.
I mean, the way I see it is people are coming from a good place, right? You know, no one sat around the table saying, well, you know, we want to destroy this, that or the other. We all want to improve it. We just have a slightly different way of getting there. And I'm a collaborator. So, you know, I thinking about our partnership, this is about making sure that our members have all of the tools at their disposal to be able to offer a really shit hot, you know, property, job, that sort of thing for their tenants. And at the same time, know that their concerns, their troubles are being listened to by the association and conveyed back to power in a way that is pragmatic and likely to get traction. And I think, you know, what we're seeing at the moment is certainly landlords and agents' voices being listened to, but the proof will be in the eating, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, listen, thank you. It's an enormous area, PRS, 20%, 25% of all housing. It's a huge area. So I should be interested to hear what people think about this. Thanks very much, Ben.